Dobro večera, good evening, esteemed guests who are in the room here and also those who have joined us online. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which is organizing a very important conference, and we're here for a day and a half for very focused dialogue, focusing, of course, on important issues such as sovereignty, citizenship in contemporary Ukraine. Welcome to Treaty 6 territory. We do start our event tomorrow in fullest, but tonight we're very privileged to host the opening keynote lecture by Dr. Oxana Shevel. This is a long-awaited event that has been postponed twice, first in 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemics, I shall say, and then in 2022 with the onslaught of Russian Federation and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine starting in February 2022. It comes together as a result of hard work and perseverance in the time when both subjects of citizenship and sovereignty are being challenged and redefined globally, including by application of force and violence, as it is the case with Russia's continuous offense on Ukraine. And our event strives to explore discourses, practices, policies, imaginaries, articulations, and experiences of both citizenship and sovereignty in Ukraine, and to connect Ukrainian studies scholarship with this very powerful transnational, global, critical citizenship studies, as we will be all undertaking it here together. The Citizenship and Sovereignty Symposium has been supported by Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada's Connections Grant, as well as funding from the Faculty of Arts, the Cole Centre for the Advanced Study, and the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies. And it is our sincere hope that this endeavor will aid in building new networks of international cross-disciplinary scholarly collaborations and partnerships in the area of critical citizenship studies of and around Ukraine and globally. I would like first to welcome our guest who will bring the greetings on behalf of Ukrainian community of Alberta, Mrs. Orisa Boychuk, my dear colleague and partner in so many undertakings. Orisa Boychuk is the president of Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council. And she has been working as a public servant for the past 26 years, Orisa, including both federal and provincial government, primarily in the role of a senior HR professional. In 2018, Orisa was elected as the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council, an umbrella organization representing the Ukrainian community organizations in Alberta. She has been navigating Ukrainian community in Alberta through some of the most challenging times, including the pandemic again, and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the Ukrainian community here in our province. Orisa holds a master's degree in sociology from our University of Alberta, and has been active community member holding various leadership roles, including committee member of the Advisory Council on Alberta-Ukraine Relations, president of UCC Edmonton, president of Ukrainian Benevolent Society. Orisa is also a recipient of several awards, including the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Award, Hetman Award, and the Alberta Federal Council Award. I would like to ask you, Orisa, to come and bring the words of welcome to our audience today.
Добрий вечір. Дуже дякую. Thank you for the warm welcome. It is a real honor to be here today on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing with you a few highlights about the work the Congress has been involved in the past couple of years. With extraordinary circumstances, on February 24th, 2022, of the Russian invasion on Ukraine called on extraordinary measures by the community. And I'm pleased to say that human kindness prevailed and continues to prevail on all fronts. Immediately after the war broke out on February 24th, 2022, our organization began connecting with community partners, collecting humanitarian aid to support Ukraine with emergency response equipment. It was incredible to see such an overwhelming response to support this crisis. We supported newcomers arrive to Canada with the first plane landing in Edmonton of displaced people. Our office immediately developed an information hub hotline where we responded to calls and questions. We established a website in both languages to help support Ukrainian newcomers arriving to Alberta. In early days, we supported the community stakeholders. We began hosting welcome information sessions with newcomers. We opened a welcome booth at the Edmonton airport. We worked with the Boilermakers Lodge Union 146, and through their generosity of 20,000 square feet, donation of space, we were able to open a furniture warehouse where currently today we continue to operate and have supported over $6.4 million worth of furniture to Ukrainian newcomers here in Edmonton and around Edmonton area, supporting thousands of families. We've supported and continue to support English classes here in Edmonton and in Calgary, and job fairs here in Edmonton and Calgary, where up to 1,000 newcomers attended, 20 to 30 employers coming to fill various positions. These events were only made possible with the support of working in partnership with community organizations and academic institutions such as MacEwan and the University of Alberta. UCC-APC has also engaged in supporting Ukraine with financial support for medical supplies for Kyiv Military Hospital, Zhytomyr Military Hospital Surgery Department, Ivano-Frankivsk Hospital, and most recently supporting the Military Brigade 59. I'd like to now just, if we could click on the video to have an opportunity to look at the highlights.
Наша зброя, правди сила, воля, честь, вогонь звитяги. Наша зброя, сила віри, що чоло кладе на стяги. Кожен з нас іде до бою, щоб назавжди бути вірним. Нам потрібна перемога, перемога в світі вільних. Перемога, честь і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі. Перемога буде з нами проти вражої орди. Сильна нашими серцями Україна назавжди. Наша сила, наші діти, наші хлопці і дівчата, що готові боронити Україну, рідну мати. Наша зброя, сила духу, вірна єдність побратимів. Наша зброя, брат за брата, Збройні сили України. Перемога, честь і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі. Перемога буде з нами проти вражої орди. Сильна нашими серцями Україна назавжди. Перемога, честь і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі. Перемога буде з нами проти вражої орди. Сильна нашими серцями Україна назавжди. Наша зброя, правди сила, воля, честь, вогонь звитяги. Наша зброя, сила віри, що чоло кладе на стяги. Кожен з нас іде до бою, щоб назавжди бути вірним. Нам потрібна перемога, перемога в світі вільних. Перемога, честь і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі. Перемога буде з нами проти вражої орди. Сильна нашими серцями Україна назавжди. Наша сила, наші діти, наші хлопці і дівчата, що готові боронити Україну, рідну мати. Наша зброя, сила духу, вірна єдність побратимів. Наша зброя, брат за брата, Збройні сили України. і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі. Перемога буде з нами проти вражої орди, сильна нашими серцями, Україна назавжди. Перемога, честь і слава, перемога, кров і біль, силу нашої держави ми пізнали в боротьбі.
So our work will continue as we monitor, assess, and address the current and upcoming needs of our community. Today, our priority is ensuring that English classes are available to our newcomers and that we are helping bridge newcomers to employers. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the organizers have worked hard to raise the funds to support this symposium that you are about to experience this evening and tomorrow. The funding came from university, from federal government, and the Ukrainian community, and host this event in person. But the reality is that due to the limited mobility of Ukrainians facing a Russian invasion, mobilization across society, and prolonged visa processing times, we are finally gathering in a hybrid format. We are grateful for this opportunity to reflect on the meaning of Ukrainian citizenship and sovereignty, especially right now, as it is being undermined by the war and simultaneously defended by its citizens and allies in Ukraine and across the globe. This event is yet another example of our resilience, our vision for a peaceful and free future. Please enjoy the next day and a half. Wishing всім великих успіхів. Дякую всім вам. Слава Україні.
Thank you, Arisa, very much for your words and reflections on what community has been doing. I'm sure we will find this background information very applicable in useful conversations tomorrow. And at this moment, I'm very pleased to move on with our evening today and introduce our keynote speaker, a dear colleague of ours who unfortunately couldn't join us in person but available to join us online. Dr. Oxana Shevel will present her talk titled Citizenship, Politics, State, and Nation Building in Ukraine. Oxana Shevel is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and the Director of the Tufts International Relations Program. Her research and teaching focus on the post-Soviet region, especially Ukraine and Russia, and topics such as nation building, identity, citizenship, and memory, politics, church-state relations, and democratization processes. She is a co-author of a book on the root causes of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia and Ukraine, entitled Histories, Divergent States. It just came out in 2023. Her earlier book, Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe, was published in 2011 and won the American Association of Ukrainian Studies prize for the best book in the fields of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. Professor Shevel serves as the Vice President of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, known to us as ASN, and of the AAUS, American Association for the Ukrainian Studies. She is a country expert on Ukraine for the European Union Global Citizenship Observatory, a member of the PONAR's Eurasia Scholarly Network, a board member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, and an associate of both Davis Center and Harvard Ukrainian Research Institutes at the Harvard University. Professor Shevel holds PhD in government from Harvard University and Master Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Cambridge, and also a BA in English and French from Kyiv State University. Welcome, Dr. Shevel. Welcome, Oksana. The floor is yours. Virtual one.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for this kind introduction and for inviting me to take part in this important symposium on citizenship, sovereignty in contemporary Ukraine. As the symposium description says, citizenship as an analytical concept spans multiple disciplines from anthropology, sociology, psychology to law and political science. And as a result, the concept of citizenship has many meanings and different ways to study it. The workshop that you will have today, that I'm really sorry to be missing. Unfortunately, I was teaching earlier today, so I couldn't join you in person. But I'm really looking forward to listening to different panels of your workshop as it addresses these multiple evolving cross-disciplinary approaches to the concept of citizenship. In my remarks today, however, I will focus on citizenship as a legal concept and on the relationship between the institution of citizenship and nationhood and state building in Ukraine. This conceptualization of citizenship and this nexus of citizenship regulation, state sovereignty, and nationhood, I would argue, is of central importance when we talk about nation and state building in Ukraine relations with Russia, and arguably even the current war that Russia wages against Ukraine. And I'll get to that point a little bit later. The war, of course, had multiple reasons, but among them, I would argue, are very different perspectives that Ukrainian and Russian political elites developed in the post-Soviet period, and in fact, even in the tail end of the Soviet period. And they pursued different political goals with using citizenship institution as a tool. What goals were the citizenship institution supposed to serve? This question was answered differently: the goal of two sovereign states as the Ukrainian state elite saw it, or the goal of these two states that emerged suddenly, unexpectedly from the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually drawing together over time, closer together, and forming eventually a political union, perhaps unification into one polity, which was the broader objective of the Russian state elites. Again, as I said, I'll come back to these points in my talk. So I will structure my talk in 4 parts today. I will begin with a very brief conceptual and theoretical summary on this relationship between citizenship, statehood, and nation in modern states. Then I'll spend the bulk of my talk applying this theoretical perspective on citizenship to the Ukrainian case, starting with the late Soviet period when Ukrainian political elites first began to use the institution of citizenship as a tool to build a distinct nation and achieve an independent state. And as I said, this development from the very beginning clashed with the preferences of the Russian state elite that wanted to use the same institution of citizenship, but as a way to preserve and ultimately strengthen a joint other than separate states. And then, so in the bulk of my talk, I'll walk over key turning points in this Ukrainian citizenship policymaking process when Ukraine managed, despite Russia's objections, to use citizenship to uphold Ukraine's distinctiveness as a nation, as a state, and how this ultimately forced Russia also to adapt its own citizenship policy. So thirdly, I'll also spend a little bit of time bringing international law and international legal institutions into the analysis of Ukrainian citizenship policymaking trajectory. I will specifically focus on dual citizenship rules and on statelessness, and we'll talk about the influence of international institutions, what they were and were not able to influence as far as the content of Ukrainian citizenship rules and why. Most of this interaction between Ukraine and international actors took place in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and there is some very rich and telling evidence that I'll briefly present to you. But I would say that these lessons are not outdated, and they hold potential for Ukraine as it hopefully will start the EU accession process. And so this interaction between international institutions that are trying to uphold and promote certain international legal standards and domestic politics around these standards in the post-communist state and specifically in Ukraine, I think citizenship lessons are important for other policy areas as well. And finally, I'll conclude with some very brief reflections on the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine, not only of the current full-scale invasion, but war starting in 2014, on both Ukraine's and Russia's citizenship policies and strategies and lessons that we can draw from these more recent developments. So that's what I'm hoping to do in my remarks today. So let me start, as I said, very briefly with a conceptual and theoretical summary of how citizenship, nationhood, and statehood are arguably related in modern states. Scholars of nationalism remind us that in the world of modern nation states, states derive legitimacy from representing a distinct nation. Canada and the United States, why are they not one state? Because there is a Canadian nation and there is an American nation. And so there is a reason for Canadian and American states, and of course, many other states to exist as political and institutional embodiments of these distinct national communities. But what is a nation? Of course, as scholars of historians, social scientists, we know that a nation is an imagined community boundaries of the community and the collective social cohesion are often flexible, debated, and evolving. Some scholar aptly described a nation membership as in a nation as a daily plebiscite. So that all that is true, but at the same time, there is a legal existence of a national community, which is also important, because as long as there is a legally defined nation, again, in this world that we live in the world of modern nation states, having legally defined nation strengthens the legitimacy of the state, even if there remains disagreement among members of this legal official nation over the boundaries and criteria for belonging. So this is where citizenship as a legal institution comes into play, because this is exactly the institution of legal citizenship, which is the main tool for defining a nation in legal sense, categorizing people as citizens of this and that state. That may seem sort of obvious, but the implications, I would say, are big, because again, implications of this logic, including implications of the absence of a legal institution of citizenship, are hugely important when we think about prospects of legitimacy of this or that state. So as long as there is a legally defined nation, which is defined through the institution of citizenship, this is ultimately what strengthens the legitimacy of a particular state. And again, the absence of this legally defined nation, something that makes statehood harder to achieve and ultimately to maintain. So what does it all have to do with Ukraine? So now if we sort of think with this theoretical lens in mind and the developments in Ukraine, in the late Soviet period, there was no Ukrainian citizenship. In the Soviet Union, there was only Soviet citizenship. Individual republics in the Soviet Union did not have their own citizenship. And once perestroika and glasnost got on the way, pro-sovereignty movements in the Union republics immediately got concerned with trying to establish institution of citizenship, again, with a goal to ultimately achieving independent sovereign statehood. The first country was Lithuania, where already in 1989, so even before the first semi-competitive elections that were held to the legislatures of the Union republics in the 1990s, already created an institution of citizenship. And let me talk now a little bit how this process unfolded in Ukraine. So I'm now moving to the kind of bulk of my remarks, where I'll be walking through some of the key turning points in Ukrainian citizenship policymaking process, political considerations that motivated this process, and disagreements between Russian and Ukrainian elites over citizenship rules. Again, I'll start with the late Soviet period. I would like to begin with an anecdote. This is something that I tell my students when I talk about this importance of citizenship as a legal concept and this nexus of citizenship, nationhood, and state sovereignty. So the anecdote is this. It was about maybe 1989 or 1990. I was then still living in Soviet Ukraine. I was a student at Kyiv State University. And one day on my way to university, I was passing by a group of people who on the street literally set up a table. They had a Ukrainian flag, which is now official flag, which at the time was still banned. They were Ruch activists. And they were basically saying that if you give them your passport data, so your Soviet passport, they will register you as citizen of Ukraine and issue you a document to this effect. So I stopped by and got myself registered as citizen of Ukraine. What did it really mean? So I gave these men my Soviet passport. They had this notebook where they wrote down my name and address and so forth. And then they gave me literally a quarter of a piece of paper. It was the time of shortages of paper and everything else in Ukraine. So the whole page would have been too much. So the page was folded in four, and you get a sliver of this paper that says your name and says you're now a registered citizen of Ukraine. So when I ask my students what was the whole thing about and why did I do this, they say that they were trying to steal my identity and why was I so stupid to share my passport data with them. That sort of seems like a reasonable response. But of course, what these activists were trying to do, the Ruch activists who wanted already at that time as a political goal, sovereignty and ultimately independence of Ukraine, they were trying to create an institution of citizenship and a group of people who would be legally defined as citizens of Ukraine. Of course, at the time, in terms of Soviet law, this exercise was completely pointless, but they were thinking ahead and in a way copying the process in the Baltic states. And then sort of the logic went that by virtue of having a group of people, who would be defined as citizen of Ukraine, the goal of attaining Ukrainian sovereignty became a step closer. Now, not much came out of this particular effort, as far as I know, of distributing the citizenship on the streets. But very shortly after that, already in May 1990, in the Soviet law was amended, Soviet law on citizenship of the USSR, and the institution of republican citizenship was created. And the law said that now Republican bodies, basically legislatures, Supreme Soviets of Union Republics, can establish the institution of citizenship with the blessing of Gorbachev in Moscow. In Ukraine, this process got underway in a few months later, in the summer of 1990, when Declaration on State Sovereignty was debated. You may be surprised to hear, I was certainly surprised when I did research and looked at the proceedings of the debate of the declaration, that the clause on citizenship turned out to be the single most controversial clause of the entire citizenship declaration. Debate took longer on this clause that simply said Ukrainian SSR has its own citizenship. That was the clause in question. And this clause took longer to debate than the clause, for example, that provided for the creation of Ukrainian armed forces. You would think that armed forces may be more controversial proposal than citizenship, but in fact, citizenship proved out to be more controversial because exactly what it did, it bore on the prospects of Ukraine remaining part of the Soviet Union or moving a step away on the road towards potential sovereignty, which of course in the 1990s, not many even, were dreaming or thinking about. But by creating this institution of citizenship, Ukraine was moving a step closer. And again, maybe not very surprisingly, those of you who know Ukrainian politics, there was sharp disagreement between the political right and the political left. So Ruch and supporters of Ukrainian sovereignty were very strongly against this clause in the declaration that Ukrainian SSR creates its own citizenship. The communists, on the other hand, who wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union and did not like Gorbachev's perestroika and all the things that came with it, so the conservative communist wing did not want this clause altogether, or they wanted it, and that was what the debate turned out to be about, they wanted the clause to say that citizens of Ukraine remain citizens of the USSR. Right, so think about the implications. So essentially, the citizenship of the Ukrainian Republic that was being created was immediately subsumed into the Soviet citizenship. And as such, it would not have arguably served as a tool of state building that the Ruch wanted. So the left and the right battled over this clause, whether it would say Ukraine simply creates its own citizenship or that citizens of Ukraine remain citizens of the USSR. And here entered Kravchuk, who is, of course, we know would later become first president of Ukraine. And he represented the third political bloc in Ukraine at the time, the so-called centrists. Many of them were former communists, or communists at the time, but they sort of changed their position, or were beginning to change their position. And many of them, for pragmatic reasons, maybe not so much for ideological reasons, for commitment to nation building, were kind of leaning in favor of having more sovereign Ukraine that they were expecting to rule. So Kravchuk proposed this compromise clause that said Ukraine creates its own citizenship and citizens of Ukraine have the right to remain citizens of the USSR, right? So it's interesting it seems minor difference, but the difference really was not minor at all because the communist favorite proposal would have subsumed Ukrainian citizenship into Soviet citizenship, thus not making it this tool of state building or potential state building that Ruch and other members of the National Democratic Right wanted. So Kravchuk proposes this compromise wording that, citizenship is created. It is not subsumed in the US into the Soviet citizenship, but potentially, again, depending which way the wind blows, people have an option to choose to remain Soviet citizen. Now, if we fast forward to the next year, which of course the last year of the Soviet Union was very eventful, again, we see this battle of citizenship and its implications for state sovereignty playing out. In the summer of 1991, that was before anti-Gorbachev coup would collapse, and when Gorbachev was negotiating with other republics and Ukraine at that part, it was part of the negotiating a new union treaty. An attempt was made to pass the entire citizenship law in Ukraine, whereby this institution of citizenship would not be just proclaimed in the declaration, but would actually come to being in the form of citizenship law. And communists successfully killed the proposal in the summer of 1991. But 3 months later, in October 1991, the same law would get passed because by that point, political context changed dramatically. Gorbachev, there was a coup against Gorbachev, the coup collapsed, Soviet Union was pretty much done, so the political reality was very different. So the very same law and sort of the prospects of retaining Union state that was still there in early summer 1991 was no longer there by November 1991. So in November 1991, the first Ukrainian citizenship law enters into force. The law laid important founding principles. First, again, I would emphasize this, the very presence of the law on citizenship created this institution of citizenship, which legislated into existence Ukrainian nation as a political and legal entity. Yes, there were a lot of cultural, social, linguistic other disagreements, but as a political and legal entity, Ukrainian nation was brought into being, which in turn gave legitimacy to the prospects of sovereign Ukrainian statehood, which of course would be confirmed in the December 1 referendum just a month after the citizenship law was passed. Also importantly, Ukrainian citizenship law of 1991 did not in any way link Ukraine to the Soviet citizenship. So when the law was adopted, Soviet Union was still legally in existence, and Russian Republic at the same time was adopting Russian citizenship law. And if you compare the debates over these laws in the two republics, which I did, it is very clear how Yeltsin is going out of his way to assure the deputies of the Russian Supreme Soviet that Russian citizenship law will not invalidate Soviet citizenship and it will not undermine the prospects of some maintenance of a common state, which in the fall, September, October 1991 in Russia, they were still expecting that might be possible to retain. So in Ukraine, there is none of that. So there is no sort of link to the Soviet citizenship. So really sovereignty is being established as a political reality. And then also importantly, the law defines the official nation very broadly. Ukrainian law was was a majority, the same formula applied in most other post-Soviet republics, adopted so-called zero-option citizenship law, meaning that everybody who had a permanent residency registration on the territory of Ukraine, at the time the law enters into force in November 1991, became citizen of Ukraine. So it was very kind of inclusive, we can say broad definition of the official political and legal nation. In contrast, where the two republics, the two Baltic republics, Latvia and Estonia, that adopted a citizenship law that excluded Soviet-era settlers and immigrants, so people who came during what they defined as the Soviet occupation of the Baltic countries from citizenship. So in Ukraine, that exclusion was not made. But who Ukraine did exclude in the legislation were the diaspora. So ethnic Ukrainians, be they people of ethnic Ukrainian origin abroad, previous waves of immigration, or ethnic Ukrainians in other republics of the former Soviet Union. They were not included. In other words, if they did not live permanently in Ukraine at the time the law was adopted, they were not entitled automatically to citizenship of Ukraine. Now, some say that this was kind of a reflection of international standards. I don't think so, because international standards on citizenship do not actually prohibit allocation of citizenship on an ethnic principle, as long as the principle of the so-called genuine and effective link is not violated. Meaning that if people who have genuine and effective link, which is generally interpreted people who permanently live in the country are included, the country is free without violating international law on adopting additional criteria, including ethnic criteria. For example, Lithuania did exactly that. Early Lithuanian law allowed people who were permanent residents in Lithuania and Soviet citizens who declared their loyalty to Lithuanian state to become citizen, and additionally, ethnic Lithuanians abroad were included, and international organizations did not have a problem with that. Now, in Ukraine, that was also the preferred position of some of the national Democrats who wanted ethnic Ukrainians in the diaspora to be given citizenship, but the communists were strongly against that. So again, there was a political trade-off. I'll come to that in a second. So importantly, right, so there's two principles of citizenship law adopted in 91. One was this broad territorial zero option, so-called citizenship law that gave all residents the right to Ukrainian citizenship. And another one, no dual citizenship. So Ukrainian law, again, there was a lot of discussion. There were attempts made by the communists in particular to enable institution of dual citizenship, and they wanted dual citizenship with Russia. But dual citizenship clause even came within just 2 votes short of being passed during discussion of the law in November, but ultimately it failed. So it now brings me to this issue of dual citizenship. So I want to talk a little bit, because again, this nexus between nation building, state building, and citizenship, dual citizenship is a very critical component that has implications, again, for strengthening separate statehood, or for potentially creating closer political links between different states. And of course, in case of Ukraine, political links with Russia, or absence of those links, was exactly what dual citizenship was about. So I'll start with a very brief kind of very quick summary of how this treatment of dual citizenship as something that impinges first and foremost on the prospects of state sovereignty or potential, diminished sovereignty and closer political integration or subordination to a neighboring state, is not how dual citizenship is now debated in Western democracies. So this notion that dual citizenship is dangerous for state sovereignty and something to be avoided, which was very much on the minds of Ukrainian political elites in the 1990s, is not really how dual citizenship has been treated in Western Europe in the decades after the Second World War. Back in the 19th century, in the first part of the 20th century, this fear of dual citizenship was also the case in West European democracies. Back in 1848, US ambassador to Germany, George Bancroft, famously said, and I quote, "One should as soon tolerate a man with two wives as a man with two countries." So that was very strong condemnation of any possibility of dual citizenship or multiple citizenship. If we fast forward to 1930s, the League of Nations Convention on questions relating to the conflict of nationality laws likewise says that every person should have one nationality and one nationality only. Here, the term nationality is used to mean citizenship. And even as early as 1960s, Council of Europe Convention on Reduction of Cases of Multiple Nationality, 1963 Convention, proclaimed the goal for signatory states to reduce as far as possible the number of cases of multiple nationality. But since the second half of 1960s and beyond, there has been growing acceptance of dual citizenship in Western democracies. And there is statistical data, collected by scholars of this European Union Democracy Observatory on Citizenship that I happen to be part of globally. And there is very clear upward trajectory in countries accepting dual citizenship and no longer seeing it as threatening. And we can think for reasons behind it. First and foremost, diminished fear of interstate wars and territorial revisions in Europe after the Second World War. And then additional factors having to do with greater gender equality, globalization, migration, a need to integrate long-term resident migrant populations to not allow them in sort of legal limbo without citizenship in Western democracies. Also electoral competition and political parties who try to appeal to the diaspora. So there are a combination of reasons, but broadly the trend has been towards greater acceptance of dual citizenship in developed Western states. But in the post-Soviet states, in Ukraine specifically, but I think post-Soviet states and maybe even new states more generally, states that emerge out of the collapse of multinational empires in the context of decolonization, state collapse, and so forth, the link between citizenship, state sovereignty, stands front and center in policy debates. And dual citizenship is playing out in this context. So dual citizenship, again, is seen as a tool that could either safeguard independent statehood or, by contrast, could be used as a tool to foster closer political integration. And oftentimes one country basically fears that the other, it would be subordinated politically to another country. And this is how the issue of dual citizenship played out politically in Ukraine. So again, the Ukrainian right, National Democrats, they wanted to extend dual citizenship, or at least they were open to extending dual citizenship to ethnic Ukrainians in the diaspora who were considered as supportive of Ukrainian quest for nationhood and statehood, and clearly did not present a political threat to that statehood. But they were categorically opposed to dual citizenship with Russia, which was seen as a tool that the Russian state would use to resubordinate Ukraine. So when faced with a choice, what was more important, ultimately they were able to give up on their insistence on dual citizenship for ethnic Ukrainians, as long as dual citizenship with Russia and basically the entire institution of dual citizenship would not come to pass. The left, by contrast, had completely different objective. They actually wanted closer political integration. They talked about recreation of the Soviet Union, of creation CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, growing closer together, Slavic Union. There were different proposals, but in all of these proposals, political proposals, Ukraine and Russia were meant to draw closer together, and dual citizenship between them and or in the context of common CIS citizenship was something that the left really was pushing for. And again, if we look at the debates in the legislature, this is exactly how this debate plays out. The left pushes for the clause, Ukraine allows dual citizenship. The right pushes against this clause. As I said, the clause dual citizenship is allowed comes just 2 votes short of being passed in November 1991. And here again, Kravchuk saves the day with a compromise. So Kravchuk, by that time president of Ukraine, who was, positioned himself as a centrist, but who was certainly interested and supportive of Ukrainian state sovereignty, we can say for self-interested reasons, proposes this compromise wording that says in Ukraine there is single citizenship, dual citizenship is allowed on the basis of bilateral agreements. And then Ukraine would never conclude any such agreement, so this clause basically would remain mute. So that was the way to get enough votes for the clause dual citizenship is allowed after it failed, then this compromise clause passes. So Ukraine passes citizenship law where dual citizenship is not instituted as of right, but this hypothetical possibility of creating it through bilateral agreements is left in the legislature, but it would never be activated. So this victory of single citizenship in Ukraine sets Russia and Ukraine again on the collision course through entire 1990s. Of course, at the time, the collision course is not military confrontation, but as I'm saying, these debates over citizenship, disagreement over citizenship rules is something that I think is an important part of the background to the current conflict as well. What Russia tries to do in the 1990s, it tries to get to Ukraine to agree to either dual citizenship with Russia or to joint CIS citizenship, sort of common citizenship for all countries that were members of this Commonwealth of Independent States that was created as a loose confederation when Soviet Union was dissolved. The logic was still the same. If citizenship was a state and nation building tool, but which state and nation are we talking about? Distinct Ukrainian nation and state or some sort of joint nation and state with Russia? Yeltsin several times delayed the signing of the friendship treaty with Ukraine because they tried to put a clause on dual citizenship in that treaty, in the friendship treaty. Ukrainian elites absolutely categorically refused, so eventually Yeltsin gave up. The way the Ukrainian elites, the language in which they talked about citizenship and dual citizenship in the 1990s is very telling. For example, Volodymyr Litvin, who was at one time Kuchma's chief of staff and also speaker of the parliament, he says, and again I quote, "If we have dual citizenship, we will not have a state." So that's how, stark the logic was. Dual citizenship meant that Ukrainian statehood is in danger from Russia, even though Russia is not explicitly mentioned. Russia, again, maybe not surprisingly, tried to couch its insistence on dual citizenship oftentimes in humanitarian terms or in purely kind of legal and juridical terms. Ukrainian state elites were not buying it. As the head of Ukrainian State Committee on Nationalities and Migration says in the late 90s, Russia follows political ends, not legal and humanitarian ends. And this nexus of citizenship and statehood, again, is playing out and helps us to explain some puzzling developments in Ukrainian political history. For example, state elites running for office, campaigning with a promise of dual citizenship with Russia, but then reneging on this promise as soon as they get elected. Kuchma had done it, Yanukovych had done it. Dual citizenship, especially in the 90s, was actually quite popular among Ukrainian voters. In 1995, so mid-1990s, about 52% of the population is in favor of dual citizenship, about 31% is opposed, the rest is undecided. By 2010, so the numbers were dropping over time gradually, but still, somebody as a strategy to run on the platform of dual citizenship in the 1990s made sense given what the voters were standing. But then again, this logic of this linking citizenship, seeing it as something that impinges directly on the prospect of sovereign statehood or on the prospect of diminished statehood and some sort of political creeping subordination to Russia helps explain why these promises were never kept by the elites who campaigned on this agenda. And again, Kuchma and Yanukovych are the most prominent ones in this category. Now, in 1996, Ukrainian constitution was adopted. Ukraine was the last country to adopt, post-communist country to adopt a constitution after very dramatic all-night-long debate. And constitution enshrined the principle of single citizenship. So that was really kind of a turning point. So these debates about dual citizenship really begin to die down after 1996, when constitution says that in Ukraine there is single citizenship, Article 4 of the constitution. Although, interestingly, there has been debate at the time as to what that clause really means, single citizenship. Does it mean no citizenship between Ukraine and other states? Or does it mean no citizenship, alternative citizenship internally, meaning there couldn't be a citizenship, say, of Crimea as an autonomous republic, right? And that's what single citizenship meant. So in the debate, if you look at the proceedings, you see these sort of arguments being brought forth. But of course, once the wording itself found its reflection in the constitution, single citizenship, it was unanimously, consistently interpreted since then as prohibition on citizenship with other states and not just a prohibition on internal citizenship of Ukrainian regions. So at the end of the day, we can say that Russia failed to pressure Ukraine into agreeing to joint or some sort of multiple or dual citizenship, and this closed the way to political reintegration by non-military means, in a sense that, and again, I think we can think about it as some precursor, not necessarily, it doesn't mean that Russia was bound to invade Ukraine, but this political integration and or subordination of Ukraine through this legal institution of dual citizenship could have potentially been achieved, but it was decidedly rejected by the Ukrainian elites even before such turning points in Ukrainian history as the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan. So again, sort of this attempt that Russia really tried, even under more, we can say, less imperialistic Yeltsin in the 1990s, clearly than his successor Putin was, but that goal of dual citizenship was pursued by Yeltsin administration very consistently, and they failed. So in sum, I would say, just to, before I move on to the international legal implications and the role international law has played, I just want to emphasize that the elites viewing dual citizenship through the lens of state sovereignty and perceived threat to it, not through the lens of individual rights, as it is, citizenship is often viewed in Western democracies, is one aspect of citizenship policies where Ukraine, and I would argue other new states, depart from what has been a Western norm and international legal trajectory. Ukraine might catch up with to this trajectory, but in a way, the way it has been playing out to date, and certainly in the 1990s and 2000s, has been quite different from the way these same legal and institutional concepts are being discussed, have been discussed in the West. So, although just one point I would add before I move on, Ukraine actually does allow dual citizenship in two very specific instances, and that follows international legal standards, more specifically the 1987 European Convention on Nationality, that says if citizenship was acquired automatically, meaning the person did not make any initiative on his or her behalf to acquire second citizenship, then signatories to the convention should allow both citizenships to exist. And in Ukraine, it essentially applies to children who were born abroad to Ukrainian parents and who automatically by birth receive second citizenship. So say children of Ukrainian citizens who are born in Canada and the United States, where children acquire citizenship automatically at birth, actually can keep both of these citizenships. And another exception is for women. It's usually women who automatically acquire citizenship when they get married to certain men from certain Muslim countries. So again, this is the law in some Muslim countries where a marriage to a citizen makes a woman automatically a citizen of that state. She does not have to apply to go through procedure to express her will. And in these two cases, a dual citizenship is allowed, but it's admittedly quite limited number of cases. So let me move to the third part of my talk, where I want to talk a little bit about another aspect of citizenship politics in Ukraine with international legal implications, and that had been the issue of statelessness and how Ukraine acted to resolve it. There is actually a very interesting story, which is not very well known, and very important lessons, I think, from the way Ukraine dealt with this challenge of statelessness with the help of international institutions, but not being really coerced by international institutions or sort of told what to do, but there was much more give and take on the part of Ukrainian elites and international institutions themselves. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So citizenship policymaking is generally considered, rightly so, as something that is the purview or in the domain of state sovereignty, something that states have ultimate say as opposed to international institutions. But at the same time, international law mandates prevention and reduction of statelessness. And there are international actors such as UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and in Europe also Council of Europe, the High Commissioner for National Minorities of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the EU itself, that all of these actors, institutions have worked in the post-Soviet states to identify cases of statelessness and to push for legal changes that would reduce and prevent statelessness. Some of you may have heard about international organizations' influence on citizenship politics in the Baltic states, in particular in Latvia and Estonia, where, as I mentioned, most of the Soviet-era residents, arrivals were excluded from citizenship, and they had, especially in Latvia, very difficult criteria to meet before they could become citizens. And in the process of joining the EU basically leaned on Estonia and Latvia to liberalize their citizenship rules, because the argument was that it creates this potential statelessness among these former Soviet-era settlers. And the liberalization did take place. Again, there are still requirements to be met and so forth, but the rules have become somewhat, softer than they would have been without international involvement. And this international involvement in the post-communist citizenship policymaking is actually a unique feature, since neither in Western states, when they were legislating their citizenship laws sometimes centuries ago, nor in the post-colonial states that were legislating citizenship rules in the 1960s and early 1970s, international institutions were involved at all. So it was really purely kind of domestic political process. But in the post-communist region, citizenship, these international watchdogs on citizenship were actively involved almost from the very beginning, maybe not from the late Soviet period, but from the early 1990s for sure. So that's also interesting, an important difference, that this legislating of citizenship rules that again consider the purview of sovereign state in the shadow of international institutions that are trying to look over and say, yes, you have a lot of power as an independent state to make these rules, but you also have to abide, especially if you claim, want to be a democratic country, integrated in Western institutions, of this criteria of prevention and reduction of statelessness, right? So your rules should be such that you do not create statelessness. And if there is already statelessness, you should make active steps as a state to reduce and eliminate the statelessness. So how does all of this apply to Ukraine? So despite having the zero-option citizenship law that I mentioned, this very expansive definition of everybody who was permanent resident in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in November 91 become citizens, there were actually a substantial number of stateless people in Ukraine, and most of them Crimean Tatars. And that became evident by sort of early to mid 1990s. Now, statelessness of this Crimean Tatar community was not a result of Ukrainian state policy, but it was really kind of a set of unfortunate, we can say, and tragic consequences of Soviet era policies, specifically Stalin's deportation of Crimean Tatars en masse in 1944, and then migration of Crimean Tatars back to Ukraine, back to Crimea, which began in 1989, more or less, when Gorbachev finally allows Crimean Tatars to return to Crimea. During the Soviet period, they were not allowed to return. And this migration begins as migration in single state, where citizenship is not an issue because everybody is a Soviet citizen. Then, of course, Soviet Union collapses, and this migration continues now as an international migration between these newly independent states that now adopt citizenship rules, adopt them at the same time. And this kind of collision, the consequences of deportation, and then how migration experience interacted with the timing of adoption of citizenship law that created problems for Crimean Tatars and created both de jure and de facto statelessness. So basically what happened was that there were three groups of Crimean Tatars. The group that moved to Ukraine, to Crimea, before Ukrainian citizenship law kicked in, was adopted and came into force in November 1991, at least legally had Ukrainian citizenship. Sometimes they had difficulty getting the documents, and there was all sorts of social and economic problems they experienced, but legally speaking, because they were already living in Ukraine in November 1991, they became citizens. That was about half of some 220,000, give or take, Crimean Tatars who came to Ukraine since the late Soviet period. Now, the remaining 120 or so people ran into a problem. About 25 of them were de jure stateless, meaning they were legally stateless, they did not have citizenship of any other state. How did this happen? Was because they came to Ukraine after November 91, so they did not receive citizenship, automatic citizenship in Ukraine, because they did not live in Ukraine in November 91. But they left their country of deportation. For most of them, it was Uzbekistan, although there were some from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and elsewhere, before citizenship law there came into force, which was in 92, 93, 94. So they did not receive citizenship of their state of deportation either. So they legally had no citizenship at all. There were about 25,000 of them in Ukraine. And then there was even larger group, about 80,000, give or take, who legally received or were considered to be citizens of their places of deportation, Uzbekistan again primarily, and other Central Asian countries, because they left these countries and moved back to Ukraine after citizenship law kicked into force there. So legally speaking, they were citizens of Uzbekistan, for example, but they were considered de facto stateless because this Uzbek citizenship was completely useless and didn't give them any rights whatsoever in Ukraine. They didn't have Uzbek passports. They couldn't exercise their legal right to Uzbek citizenship in any meaningful way. So international community considered them de facto stateless, right? So, and And the question is, why can't they get Ukrainian citizenship? So again, here politics really becomes important, and this kind of nexus of citizenship, territoriality, statehood, and nationhood also plays out in the case of Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars actually were very important for the Ukrainian state because they played in the 1990s and 2000s very important counterbalance to pro-Russian separatist sentiment in Crimea. So Ukrainian state was interested in them becoming citizens and voters because they generally voted for national democratic parties and not for pro-Russian parties, and were kind of like, the Ukrainian force in Crimea. But at the same time, since many of them legally had citizenship of Uzbekistan and other Central Asian countries, if they were just given citizenship of Ukraine, that would create a precedent of dual citizenship. And this is something Ukrainian state elites were very eager to avoid, because again, dual citizenship would have set a precedent, and there were fears that then Russia would push for dual citizenship as well. And that was a no as far as Ukrainian state elites were concerned. So this again becomes really kind of complicated way. How does it get solved? So international community, in particular UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, which has under its mandate prevention and reduction of statelessness, was very actively involved. And the interaction was actually, and this is the part that I want to highlight, because again, it shows how Ukraine specifically and post-communist region is quite different when it comes to statelessness, and how some of the arguments being made about international influences that they, for example, can just coerce these weak domestic governments to do certain things, right? Or that the governments are uninformed, and here comes this international expert and tells them what to do. This is not really how it played out in Ukraine. So originally, international institutions wanted basically the Ukrainian state to allow Crimean Tatars to renounce their Uzbek, Kazakh, and other citizenship, and then acquire Ukrainian citizenship after they have done this. But Ukrainian state really took a position, Ukrainian state elites, that this would not be legally meaningless, because an individual doesn't have a right to renounce citizenship, or rather, it wouldn't sort of have full legal consequences if the state in question still considered them citizens. You can burn your passport, but it's not going to make you any less Canadian, right? As long as Canada still considers you your citizen. So the same logic was applied in the case of Crimean Tatars. So Ukrainian state elites said, no, we are not going to allow this, because that would create a precedent for dual citizenship. So then in the course of these very intense and very nuanced negotiations, a compromise was found. So international institutions basically took on board this position of the Ukrainian government and eventually helped to negotiate an agreement that first Ukraine signed with Uzbekistan and ultimately with several other Central Asian countries, whereby governments prepared lists of people who were citizens of, say, Uzbekistan. These lists then were transferred to to Uzbek embassy. The Uzbek government, not individual Crimean Tatars, but the Uzbek government said, okay, we are going to release all these people from Uzbek citizenship. And then Ukrainian state could allocate them Ukrainian citizenship, therefore avoiding dual citizenship cases. So again, this solution was not anywhere in international law, and they want to emphasize that really it was a case, we can say, of really successful solution to statelessness, at least in the legal and political sense. And it came about by international institutions and the government really working together, instead of international institutions kind of insisting and approaching it through the lens of purely international law and applying the same yardstick, the same tools that maybe worked elsewhere to Ukraine. So there was really much more awareness of domestic constraints and this working of international domestic actors to find a mutually acceptable solution. And I think there are many lessons from this kind of interaction, which is not really well known, but I think it's really quite fascinating case how this UNHCR and Ukrainian government worked together in the 90s. And I think there are lessons for some of the current tensions that we read about in the news, be it minority language education or situation with the Moscow-affiliated Orthodox Church, when again some international standards are involved, the standard of proportionality, the standard of non-discrimination, but what it really means and what constraints Ukraine is facing, especially now that it is facing Russian aggression, and how some of these minority principles, freedom of religion and so forth, interact with this political context that Ukraine finds itself in. So I think there are potentially important lessons to be drawn from this UNHCR Ukrainian government solution to statelessness problem of Crimean Tatars in the 90s, that may be best practices that could be incorporated into the dealing with these other issues that are current and pressing today. So let me just say a few more things by way of moving to my concluding observations on where things stand today, following Russian military aggression against Ukraine, and the aggression that was first limited in 2014, the hybrid war, annexation of Crimea, and of course, war in Donbass and full-scale invasion since 2022. I'll start with good news, and the good news is that in Ukraine, this political, legal, and imagined national community came into much closer alignment as a result of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So that's sort of one of the ironies of Putin's aggression. So the state, of course, can designate people as citizens, and as I was mentioning in my talk, I think doing so makes them members of official nation, and that does have implications for statehood, for nationhood, for sovereignty. But at the same time, if people do not feel themselves as belonging to the national community, yes, they can be legally citizens, but do we really have a nation as a political community, as a social community, as a national community? And in Ukraine, we see, following this Russian aggression that starts in 2004, we see the process of increased citizens' identification with the Ukrainian state, and the importance of citizenship as a civic identity. The number of people who now say that they are citizen of Ukraine and that's their primary identity has been growing slowly since 1990, and really sharply. We see that in the opinion polls since the beginning since post-Euromaidan period. Now it is the dominant identity for large majority of Ukrainians. So again, sort of inadvertently, if there is any silver lining in this terrible war, is that Putin inadvertently helped create the self-aware Ukrainian political nation that he ultimately wants to destroy, but it came together in part because of the threat that Ukraine faced and how Ukrainian citizens rallied around the state and their civic Ukrainian identity. Now, this link, the second concluding point I want to make, that this link between citizenship, statehood, and nationhood remains in the minds of political elite in Russia and Ukraine to this day. So my talk was primarily of how it unfolded in Ukraine in the 1990s and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in the 90s and 2000s, but this link remained, and Russia actions show it very clearly. After Russia failed to pressure Ukraine to agree to dual citizenship in the 90s and early 2000s, it began to engage in unilateral action on citizenship, this passportization, extending citizenship, legal citizenship, to residents first of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, also Crimea, and then following with territorial claims under the veneer of protecting citizenship. So again, kind of extending its claim to statehood, trying to extend its territory, using citizenship, legal citizenship, as a tool, as a legitimation mechanism to do this aggressive sort of state-building agenda or empire-building agenda. After Russia unilaterally imposed citizenship on Crimean residents first and ultimately also on citizens of Donbass, it was not accidental. I don't think that Putin's decree making all residents of Donbass eligible for Russian citizenship was issued literally days after Zelensky got inaugurated as president. This made solution to Donbass conflict inherently harder. It staked Russian hybrid claim to the territory, now populated by people it claims to be its citizens. And of course, then in 2022, when Russia launches its full-scale invasion, is in part to protect these citizens from supposed genocide, quote unquote, that they claim Ukraine was perpetuating against its citizens. With its full-scale invasion, Russia failed to annihilate Ukrainian statehood militarily, but it is actively trying to eliminate Ukrainian nationhood on occupied territories under the guise of so-called denazification through propaganda, education policies, memory policy, brute repression, but it also is annihilating Ukrainian state and nation through its own citizenship rules. Recent amendments to Russian law made all Ukrainians, not just Donbass residents or Russian speakers or so-called compatriots as previous laws, but literally all citizens of Ukraine automatically eligible for Russian citizenship. So legally, Ukrainian nation would be legislated out of existence if Russia wins, as it is now being legislated on whatever territory Russia controls. So the more territory Russia grabs, the more Ukrainian nation as a political and legal entity gets eliminated, because now everybody is reclassified as a Russian citizen. And of course, on the occupied territories, Russia is threatening repression and basically forcing people to take Russian citizenship, threatening them with loss of business, lack of access to healthcare, and even deprivation of parental rights of parents who refuse Russian citizenship for themselves and for their children. And the fact that Putin bothers with citizenship rules, I think, shows that he really cares, and he continues to see this link between his maximalist goals of eradicating Ukrainian state sovereignty and legal institution of citizenship. Now, finally, In Ukraine, there are two interesting political tendencies that are worth sort of thinking about. I'm not going to say much about them. Maybe there would be time in Q&A, but I just wanted to highlight them. So first of all, dual citizenship policy, even though it remains about state sovereignty, also has a dimension of elite power struggle. And we see this, I think there is a danger of the state potentially exercising power arbitrarily. What I'm getting to here is this phenomena that we see in Ukraine, maybe not on a mass scale yet, but it became more prevalent, and it could become more prevalent still, of people being deprived of their Ukrainian citizenship by the presidential decree, because president has the authority ultimately to do this, with an argument that they have acquired another citizenship, usually Russian citizenship. Now, the problem, of course, is that nobody really knows how many people have acquired Russian or any other citizenship. And using this argument as a reason to deprive somebody of Ukrainian citizenship could escalate into persecution of political opposition, or sort of getting rid of your political opponents and so forth. I'm not saying this is what's already happening, but there are some warning signs actually even before the invasion, when the law was applied differently to different people. So there is sort of this another dimension of dual citizenship and prohibition on dual citizenship, which has this element of political competition that could be somewhat problematic from a democratic standpoint. So again, something to watch out for. I think it's a little bit too early to draw conclusions, right? And finally, this attempts, and this is where Ukrainians' dual citizenship policy may move in the future, to now adopt this more nuanced, not sort of be accepted or be rejected, but to allow it with certain types of countries. Latvia was the first trailblazer in this regard when it first, just like Ukraine, refused to allow dual citizenship, but then began to allow it with friendly countries, members of NATO, members of the EU, and other Western democracies. And in Ukraine, there have been attempts, including by the President Zelensky. There were two draft legislations he submitted, first in 2020 and then again in 2021, just before the invasion, that would have legalized dual citizenship in Ukraine, but only with countries that would have met sort of the friendly criteria. What these criteria were was never fully defined because these laws stalled for a variety of reasons. But we might see, again, if we're sort of looking forward, what may be happening in citizenship policymaking in Ukraine. I think it's not inconceivable, perhaps after the war, that dual citizenship would actually be legalized, but conditionally, with Western democracies, not with so-called aggressor state, and Ukrainian state elites keep talking about it. I think just a few days ago, maybe a month ago, Foreign Minister Kuleba, addressing actually Ukrainian-Canadian, gathering, said that Ukraine hopes, plans to adopt this kind of legislation. Now, the constitutional prohibition on dual citizenship stands in the way, but in April this year, Constitutional Court took on the issue of clarifying the meaning of Article 4 of the Constitution that says in Ukraine there is single citizenship. So again, if there's a Constitutional Court ruling allowing the possibility of dual citizenship, sort of more creative interpretation of this clause, and then this kind of more nuanced approach to dual citizenship with certain countries, we might actually see Ukraine change from its previous pattern and allow dual citizenship under certain circumstances. So I will end here and thank you for your attention.
Oksana, thank you so much for your insightful talk. It's amazing to realize how much citizenship as an institution can be instrumentalized for so many different purposes. And in particular, of course, in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine, it's just enlightening to know to what degree it can be done. We are here for a Q&A session.
Just a small question. For those people who've been deported into Russia, have been made into Russian citizens, if they were to be repatriated, what procedure would have to be undergone to restore their Ukrainian citizenship, including the ones in the occupied territories? You mentioned that the regime, citizenship regime in Ukraine is sort of top-down. That is, the state decides who is a citizen. It's not from the bottom up as a individual human right, unless I'm misconstruing your sophisticated talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. I'll give a two-part answer. Ukrainian citizenship of people who were deported to Russia or who on the occupied territories and were forced to take Russian citizenship, their Ukrainian citizenship has not been invalidated. So Ukraine took this position and it has taken this position already in the 1990s, kind of acknowledging the fact that it has no leverage over any other country, Russia, of course, but any other country, right? If Canada gives a Ukrainian immigrant Canadian citizenship, there is nothing Ukraine can do about it. Like they don't allow dual citizenship, but they can't prevent other countries issuing their citizens, citizenship of that country. So they simply don't recognize the other citizenship. So that's what it is. So ultimately, all these Ukrainian citizens who were forcefully deported to Russia, who were issued Russian citizenship, whether they took it voluntarily or were coerced or some sort of in between, they're still considered Ukrainian citizens for the purposes of the Ukrainian law, and their Russian citizenship is essentially null and void as far as Ukraine is concerned. So if they make their way back to Ukraine, safe from deportation, even if their citizenship documents are lost, there is a procedure to restore these documents, and it may be sort of bureaucratically complicated, but they don't have to requalify or anything like this. Where I see potential danger lying, right? If you think about it, has been actually also discussion within the Ukrainian political class, and members of the elite openly disagreed with each other, kind of on air, whether or not Ukrainians who take Russian citizenship could be considered kind of disloyal to the Ukrainian state, or are these people taking Russian citizenship simply to survive? And I think this is where we may sort of if we think post-occupation, post-liberation, getting into this potential gray zone, right? Like if the state is going to, say, persecute collaborators, the criteria for collaboration are not super clear in the law. And say one having Russian citizenship, if it were to be used as criteria for collaboration, I think we're really getting into the shaky ground here, because it is really hard to say if people really had a choice not to take on Russian citizenship. So in some cases, actually, this Russian incredibly aggressive and forceful passportization kind of helping the Ukrainian case, because I think it is making it more and more evident that it's very difficult if you are living there for if you can't leave, to function without having taken Russian citizenship. So hopefully the mere presence of Russian citizenship would not be considered criteria for collaboration. Now, this whole sort of individual rights, the second part of your question, when I was saying top down, I was just more saying that this is how my own analysis, this is as a political scientist, this is what I was mainly looking at, what state is doing. I, of course, don't deny that there is a lot of bottom-up sort of processes, and this is what I think most of the symposium will be about, kind of unpacking citizenship from different dimensions. But this sort of bottom, top-down view, meaning that the state, takes certain position. I think the huge challenge is that Ukrainian state really has no idea who has Russian citizenship, how many of these people have it. And then how do you even find out if, say, there is a prohibition in Ukraine, even in the current law, of certain government positions to be held by people who have foreign citizenship? If somebody who has Russian citizenship, say, decides to keep it after, when they move back to Ukraine or when they leave the occupation, and then they get, they become a judge, right? And they still have Russian citizenship, and Ukrainian state doesn't really know this. What does this really mean? So I think there is a lot of kind of potential, I don't know what would be the right word, pitfalls, dangers, potential conflict areas. But as far as sort of the basic, the short answer to your question, that nobody's Ukrainian citizenship was invalidated because they were deported to Russia or were forced to take Russian citizenship. Ukrainian state simply say, we don't recognize that Russian citizenship, and you are still a Ukrainian citizen.
I have one question and one kind of comment to what you just said. So the question is, do you see the wave of forced emigration from war-related emigration from Ukraine over the last 1.5 years influencing the future discussion of dual citizenship in Ukraine? And the comment was just an interesting kind of fact. There was actually a case when judges in Crimea were, after the annexation, were in absentee accused of treason. The argument that they brought to the Ukrainian court was, well, we are citizens of Russia. The Ukrainian state said, well, you cannot do that. You remain a citizen of Ukraine until we say you are not. And so they were recognized as committing state treason for taking even that, for being judges under occupation.
Yeah, the comment exactly shows, that was part of my answer to the earlier question, that Ukraine does not recognize that citizenship that Russia imposed, or even if people willingly took it, And basically, you can't get away by saying like, okay, like, you can't try me, I'm Russian citizen, call me Russian consul. They just simply don't recognize it. And that's actually not that uncommon. I mean, US do the same thing. For example, Russia does it too. So, somebody who's dual citizen and you go to, so in relations to the state, you remain only that citizen, right? So if you go, say, like I recently became American citizen and I'm still Ukrainian citizen, don't tell the embassy because they could initiate a procedure to deprive me theoretically, right? I can't go to Ukraine, commit a crime, and say, call me American consul because I'm American citizen. They just won't recognize that, right? So that's kind of, it does apply to occupation, but it's a broader policy. Now, your question, what does the immigration from Ukraine, how it might change debates on dual citizenship? I think it really might, because now, in addition, of course, to people who have always had these tragic experiences, traumatic experiences being deported to Russia or having had to flee there under the bombs because there was no other option, there are, of course, many, millions of people who left and who are in Western countries. And, if the war drags on and people stay there, eventually some of them would become, citizens. And then what does the Ukrainian state do about this, right? So I think, again, this kind of new tendency that Latvia really sets some maybe 10 or so years ago, and that Ukraine has been really considering to allow dual citizenship, to recognize it with so-called friendly countries, and that would be, Western democracies, NATO, EU members, maybe places like Japan, that there is some sort of list of like suitable countries circulating, but it won't be Russia, right? It won't be Belarus. So that could be one possibility. Now, another possibility, which I think has also some pitfalls, this was actually in the proposal that Zelensky submitted to the parliament just 2 months before the invasion in December of 2021, which actually made it a requirement for people who acquire foreign citizenship to report it to Ukrainian authorities, right? Like now there is no such requirement. So if the state happens to find out, they either don't recognize it or they could initiate a procedure. There is a procedure in the law to deprive somebody of their Ukrainian citizenship for the reason of voluntarily acquiring foreign citizenship. This procedure is done quite rarely, but it has been done and it can be done. So this sort of deprivation of Ukrainian citizenship because somebody, took on other citizenship. But what this law that the Zelensky submitted that did not get approved, that is still sort of, suspended in the parliament, would make it administrative offense of not reporting your second citizenship or third, as the case may be, or whatever other citizenship, right? And that is sort of like, I'm not sure what to think about it, because on the one hand, maybe it's not so unreasonable, right? You got as a citizenship, let your home state know. But if now there are administrative penalties for not doing this, you can imagine how, again, this penalty may be applied not systematically, but selectively. So it is sort of like, again, this law did not become to pass, but to your question, like how it might affect future dual citizenship, I see these two possibilities. One would be that Ukraine would allow it with essentially Western democracies who are allies of Ukraine, and will not allow it with Russia and sort of, axis of evil and so forth. But another one could be this sort of like, giving the government discretion to apply the law selectively, to punish some people maybe for having multiple citizenships, to not punish other people. You can sort of begin to see how it might enter political competition. At the time of elections, a candidate could be disqualified, for example, because they haven't reported their second citizenship. And the candidate may say, well, I actually don't have that second citizenship. That's a provocation against me. Like, how are we going to be able to tell that, right? So that's also, again, I think this is sort of like thinking ahead and just hypothesizing what might come. But again, given the content of the law that Zelensky submitted to the parliament just months before the full-scale invasion, it seems like that's at least on the minds of some of the Ukrainian political class.
Oksana, thank you. We will ask our colleagues from the online audience for the questions. And Vita.
Thank you. So the first one, did Ukraine's rejection of some sort of the post-Soviet status play a role in its failure to access its rightful share of Soviet assets, including real estate abroad, museum treasures, and Sberbank deposits?
I want to say that it didn't really affect it either way. I think because, if again, I can't claim great expertise on this question, but if I remember correctly, there was sort of like an agreement reached between Russia and other republics that they would assume the Soviet debt as well as the Soviet assets and like the gold reserve and all of that stuff. And then there were kind of accusations / speculations or maybe valid claims that the value of these assets that Russia took was much higher than what was revealed. And in fact, and then some of the debt was maybe forgiven or never paid. So it was basically a bad deal for these all other republics, and they should have, gotten a share of Soviet assets, gold reserve, Communist Party assets, and so forth. But I don't really think the citizenship would have made a difference unless, again, for example, if Ukraine, it's not even about post-Soviet status as put in the question. I think it was more like if, say, Ukraine did integrate with Russia politically and formed some sort of like Slavic union or, agreed to, say, the creation of CIS citizenship, and then there would have been political integration within CIS, maybe creation of some sort of new polity, federation, confederation, what have you. And then, they all share in this Soviet, the Soviet reserves, maybe, right? So I think it would have, I can sort of see how it's potentially related to citizenship, but I don't think it's about post-Soviet status. I think it was really, the states acting as separate states, agreeing to this deal, which in the hindsight seems like was much better for Russia than for these other states, or potentially recreating, Soviet Union 2.0, some sort of common polity, and then that common polity taking over all of the Soviet assets and the Soviet debt. Right, but then again, we can say even in the common polity, Ukraine itself would not have gotten that much. It would have gone to Moscow or wherever the center of that common polity would have been. So probably wouldn't have made much difference.
The forced deportation and movement of Ukrainians in the last couple of years is not the first time this has happened during war and conflict. During the Second World War, you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, either deported or moved themselves to the West. And then during the First World War, again, you had this interesting discussion, debate as to the impact of carrying an Austrian passport in Canada during a war. Anybody in areas of your study looking at those two periods of time for examples of how issues were being addressed at that time and whether they're particularly relevant today? And again, one of the critical things is that there is a difference between the British type system of citizen or subjecthood and a continental, which again is sort of recognizing that dichotomy as well. But the main question is anybody looking at those two previous historical situations for examples on how to deal with some of the issues that you're addressing today?
I am not aware that there is sort of active study of how kind of specific legal and institutional challenges stemming from earlier waves of migration, disintegration of empires, and sort of it's drawing lessons, concrete lessons by Ukraine for current deportation and all of this Russian forced passportization. I'm not aware of this work being done in Ukraine for sure, or among scholars of contemporary Ukraine. Perhaps historians may have looked into it, and I do know that as far as international, kind of broadly international refugee studies and international citizenship study, the experience of migration in the wake of the collapse of Russian Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially Bolshevik takeover and collapse of Russian Empire, that has been studied because basically the first international refugee protection mechanisms set up under the League of Nations period were in response to these stateless refugees from Bolshevik Russia. So, of course, many of them were Ukrainians, but there were also others. And this whole Nansen passport, this concept of refugee, this concept of statelessness, so it had, I would say, kind of fed into and was maybe a push to the development of international refugee regime and these international legal safeguards and concern of international community with statelessness, because before, like, nobody really talked about, statelessness. There wasn't sort of this kind of firm borders and so forth. So in that sense, it did play a role. But as far as these concrete lessons, like these were the specific legal problems a certain group of people had in the 1920s and the 1940s and the 1950s, and that's how it was dealt with. And can we take these lessons and apply them now to the kind of predicament many Ukrainians are facing? I'm not aware of that kind of work being done at all, which is not to say that it isn't. I'm just saying that I'm not aware, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. My very capable colleague Vita is waving to me to say that it's time to wrap up the session. I'm looking forward to hosting you, Oksana, tomorrow in some sessions. You've mentioned you might be joining us, and we might have an opportunity to
fine.
continue this conversation with you in particular tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for launching our event in such an effective and powerful way. I'm very pleased to have you with us tonight, and I'm looking forward to, again, reconnecting tomorrow with you and those here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
yet
much
again.
for the invitation. Щиро дякую.
Yeah.
До побачення.